Hello, I'm Dame Judith Hackitt, and I'm very pleased to have this opportunity to speak at this nima conference. The title of my presentation today is about the time to rethink, to reset, and for us all to take our responsibilities seriously and to act proportionately with the new system that is coming. Times are changing, and it's important that we not only reflect on what our role is going to be within the new system, but also that we talk to one another to ensure that we're all on the same page and we all understand what our respective roles and responsibilities are going to be. In my presentation, what I want to do is to take you through the progress that's been made, the journey so far, and then talk about where we're now headed and to emphasize just how important digital is going to be through all of this. So, 6 years ago, when that awful tragedy occurred at Grenfell Tower, we were all in a state of shock at what had happened. For many, that shock and the horror of that day will never be forgotten. But for some, the memory of just why it happened has maybe faded. Certainly, people have focused on very specifics, but what's important to recognise now is that the only way we are going to fix this is by truly systemic change. We must make those changes and we must get it right. So, as I said, I want to talk through how we got to where we are today. So to remind you, the tragedy occurred in June 2017. Almost immediately, the public inquiry was announced. And as many of you will know, in spite of an interim report some years ago, we are still, as we speak today, awaiting the final outcome of that public inquiry. But very soon after the public inquiry was set up, in August of the year of the fire, I started my independent review of building regulations and fire safety. Less than a year later, in May 2018, I published the final report, and very soon thereafter was asked to chair the Industry Safety Steering Group, which has been running since then and continues to operate today, seeking to drive that change in industry at the same time as the policy work has been going on to set up the new building safety regulator and the construction products regulator, and of course to drive the Building Safety Act through to the point where it achieved royal assent in April 2022. And since then, of course, we have started to see the first elements of implementation through Gateway 1, the registration of all buildings in October of this year, and of course the Act takes full effect next year. It is interesting that we're now starting to hear some people say this is all happening too fast. My answer to many of them is no, it isn't. We're doing this as fast as we possibly can, and an awful lot of people deserve an awful lot of credit for getting us this far. Not least the people in the new building safety regulator and officials in DLUC. But industry too has had a long time to prepare, but for various reasons has chosen in the past to wait and see rather than getting on with things that could have been being done already. So if this now appears to be a rush, that's only because of some of that inactivity that has slowed the industry down thus far. Having said all of that, I would be the first to acknowledge that since the tragedy at Grenfell Tower, we have all had to deal with numerous other issues and very big issues that have taken our attention and which have an impact upon the built environment, whether that's Brexit, COVID, the requirements to meet rapidly changing climate developments, concerns about health risks in buildings, inflation, the emergence of concerns about aerated concrete, This is a long list, and it will go on being a long list because things will always continue to change as we move forward. What we cannot do, however, is to allow all of those things to get in the way of us doing what we know we have to do in terms of building safety. But what it does do is it means that we have to recognise that this is a journey, not a simple one-off change. And also to recognise that alongside building safety, we also have to address other issues of quality and resilience, because it is our collective responsibility to fix all of these things for the long term. And I do genuinely mean collective. We all have a part to play. Some people may think, what difference can I make? My role in this is very small. But the reality is that everyone's role truly matters. And we require lots of champions in this system to be committed to making things work. So we've talked about the timeline. We've talked about the production of my review, which has now made its way into the Building Safety Act. And I now just want to talk through some of those reasons for failure that I found back in 2018. Because as I've said, people's memories get quite selective and they pick on a few. But it's important, I think, to recognise just how much of the system was laid bare as being inadequate. Despite my review initially focusing on the regulatory system, and it was very quick and easy for me to reach the conclusion that the regulatory system itself was weak and ineffective, there was little or no enforcement, and it became clear that we were going to need a new regulator. But many of my findings were about the role of industry and the failings within industry. Because the regulatory system was weak, industry had allowed itself to get into this race to the bottom, where they would do the least they could get away with. There were conflicts of interest pretty much everywhere I looked. For someone who came from a different industry sector, the quality of the record keeping for me was one of the biggest shocks. In many cases, it simply didn't exist. Change management, the design process itself, was really not well documented in so many of the cases that I looked at, whether that be during design, construction, or in the refurbishment process. And if you don't have accurate records of what you have, it's very hard to manage what it is you are dealing with going forward. It was also clear that lots of people knew that these problems existed. Experts were not listened to when they raised concern, and neither were residents. So it was clear to me that the culture of the whole industry has to change. I highlighted the problems with product testing and assurance, but recognised that in the time I was asked to do that report and to do it within a year, I didn't have time to investigate the product issues as thoroughly as I would have wanted to. But nonetheless, I think it's important to look at this whole list of failings that were found and to recognise just how many of them need to be driven by a change in thinking and an acceptance of responsibility by those in industry. So the new regime, the new regulatory regime, which is underpinned by a set of key principles, is now very close. In fact, some are already feeling the impact of that, whether that be by putting new proposed buildings through Gateway 1, or indeed those who have had to register existing buildings by the deadline of the 1st of October. But what we are going to see in the coming months is that manifestation of a truly systems-based approach to both the regulations themselves and to the way in which people look at buildings. Competence and accountability will be at the heart of the system. This is a culture change, and that presents opportunities. Opportunities where there will be positive incentives for those who have good practices and who are willing to stand up and be counted for doing the right thing. But there will be serious sanctions for those who continue to drag their feet and try to game the system. It's also important to remember that this is a risk-based and proportionate regulatory framework. The principles apply across the board to all buildings, not just high-rise. But the way in which those principles are applied changes with the risk level of the building. That is why, in the case of high-rise buildings, we have the safety case approach. But let's be very clear that we need to adopt the same principles in a proportionate way to all buildings of all heights. This is an outcomes-based framework. What does that mean? It means the extent to which the regulator is going to tell industry what to do is going to be less than ever before. The onus and the responsibility for deciding what is the right thing to do rests with those who are nominated duty holders, and it is for them to demonstrate to the regulator they are doing the right thing and they are doing all that they can to manage and reduce the risk in buildings. That's how we are going to focus on delivering quality buildings, which are safe and feel safe for people to live in. There does, of course, as part of all of this, not only need to be a new relationship between the regulator and industry, but also between industry and those who will use the buildings and live in them, the residents. We have to engage with them in a different way if we are going to regain their trust and give them the confidence that the buildings they live in are safe. All of this requires a very, very good record-keeping system. And the words, the golden thread, are becoming heard more and more as we move forward. So, as I said at the start of my presentation, this is a time for us all to rethink and to reset and to consider the role that we need to play in the new system. Because regulatory change is at the heart, of course, a very necessary precursor for the change that is coming, but not the whole story by any means. The new outcomes-based framework shifts responsibility, accountability, and ownership onto those who are doing the designing, doing the constructing, and the building. They are the ones who will be the duty holders. There are those who say they're still waiting for further detail, but that misses the point, because that detail is not going to be coming in an outcomes-based framework. This is very much more about industry deciding how to build safely and to demonstrate that in a systemic way to the regulator to get approval to go ahead. If you think about that and think about the changes of behaviour that are going to need to happen in order to present that systems-based approach for the regulator to approve, it seems to me that the industry has got to start and very quickly get out of its silo mentality and do much, much more collaboration than ever before. It also seems self-evident that you cannot assume that others have done their bit. That needs to be assured. You need proof, not only that they have done it, but that they have done it well and they have done it to the right standard. You need to consider what could go wrong and demonstrate that you have taken steps to mitigate those adverse events to the best of your ability. And crucially for me, in terms of involving everyone, it's really important for us to recognise that any building's integrity depends upon multiple layers of protection. And each and every one of those layers of protection are important to the integrity of the building. All of that, for me, drives the need for one single platform for information sharing. This may feel like a huge challenge, but as I've said, this is a journey. No one expects everything to be perfect from day one, but I have a strong sense that the tide is turning and people do recognise that need to change. I was particularly encouraged to hear that after a very slow start back in April, by the deadline of the 1st of October, more than 14,000 high-rise buildings were registered, and that process of completing that registration continues as we speak. I mentioned earlier that this is no longer, in my view, just about building safety and, in particular, not just related to the specific of fire. This is about recognising that there are links between quality, sustainability, and resilience. We all have that duty to provide buildings that are not just safe, but are sustainable. This is a fundamental culture change for industry. It requires clarity of purpose, a sense of ownership and responsibility, and that all-important shift to greater transparency, underpinned by good digital record keeping. That means that for things like multiple occupancy buildings in particular, which are complex systems, we need to increase the level of knowledge and appreciation of what systems thinking means throughout the industry. That design, construction, and into operation life cycle needs to be thought of as a process of building and maintaining asset integrity. And we all have a role to play in that. On this slide, I wanted to present to this industry a concept that is very familiar to people who work in oil and gas or chemicals. And it's this whole notion of the importance of layers of protection. We call it the Swiss cheese model. And what it shows you is that no matter how hard you try, no single layer of protection is effective and will always have some potential to fail at some point. But by having multiple layers of protection, the chances of those holes, those flaws in the system all lining up at the same time is significantly decreased and therefore provides greater protection for the building. The reason I present it here today is that I want everyone to recognise that no matter how small your part in that building, it's nonetheless important because it is one of those layers of protection. I mentioned earlier that very soon after my report was complete, that I took on the role of chairing the Industry Safety Steering Group. We've met every 2 months for the last 5 years, and we have learned a lot about the progress that is being made by industry. From the outset, it was clear that some were ready to change and wanted to be part of that process of shaping change going forward. But we also encountered a large number of people who hoped this was never going to happen, or who wanted to wait and see what others would do or say first. I'm pleased to say that more recently, we have started to see many more stepping up and showing that industry leadership that is so, so important to making this system work. But what we've also encountered is that the knowledge about the need for this change extends beyond the built environment industry itself. Increasingly, these days, we find ourselves talking to the insurance industry and to financial markets. And I think it's really important that people recognise that it won't just be the regulator who is asking you in industry to prove that you're doing the right thing. Those requests are going to come from others on whom you depend for finance and for risk transfer. So it really is important that we have all of that data, we have all of that record keeping, because we are going to be sharing that with multiple stakeholders. So competence is going to become important to everyone who is part of this system. I cannot emphasize enough how much this new regime is about focusing on demonstrating safety and fitness for purpose of the buildings, ensuring that those buildings are not only safe for use on day one, but that they will continue to be so throughout their life. As I said, the safety case regime will apply to those buildings of highest risk, those where there is the potential for multiple deaths in the event of an adverse event. And that use of height as a proxy for risk merely indicates that need for a greater level of attention, but the same principles to apply to all buildings. We have gateways now in the system at planning, design, and commissioning stage. It will not be enough anymore to say what you intend to build and then build something different. Everything will have to be recorded. You will have to demonstrate that what has been built was what was designed, or if not, why it was changed. In turn, the implications for the supply chain are clear. You need to be ready to provide data, to provide performance accreditation. All of that requires collaboration, a standardized system, good performance testing and assurance. You'll have to think very hard about where and when substitution is possible. And I see this overall as being a great opportunity for BIM and digital to make inroads into this sector, which are long overdue. But I would also ask you to reflect on just how much this is about industry changing itself, not about doing it because the rules and regulations demand it of you. I just want to focus for a few moments on the difference between how the new regulatory regime is going to impact new buildings and then existing buildings in occupation. In new build, this is all about getting the system right for the future. Starting with digital from day one, building that golden thread as the idea turns into a reality and a building occupied by people. Providing that assurance and proof of quality, determining what information needs to be recorded and kept and in what form, ensuring that that is going to be available to building owners, occupiers, financiers, regulators and others, means you need to think about the form in which it will be presented. This is a real opportunity to leave that race to the bottom behind and really set new standards. Of course, this is a very different challenge when applied to existing buildings. If the information was not gathered at the time, it's going to be difficult to go back and compile that golden thread and that data record. But for those high-rise and high-risk buildings that are within scope of the new regulation, efforts must be made to do what we can to build up a picture of those buildings. But as I've said already several times in this presentation, I am confident that the regulator will do that in a proportionate way. But industry needs to do the best it can to pull what records it has together. Simply defending past poor practice by saying we don't have anything will not be good enough. Not knowing cannot be an excuse without there has been some due diligence to see what can be found and what can be compiled. We are going to see this roll out from April next year when the regulator turns its attention to buildings in occupation. But April next year will come quickly, and the time to be searching for that information and doing that due diligence is now. And if you're going to do it now, why would you not do it in a digital way? My review, of course, because of Grenfell, focused very much on addressing those buildings where there is the highest risk for the potential loss of life. We've used height, as I've said, as a blunt proxy for level of risk. But let's be clear that at this turning point in the world of the built environment, we are very, very sure that what we want to see is a shift to where everyone can feel safe in their home, irrespective of the type of dwelling that they choose to live in. And the new regulatory regime sets out to ensure exactly that. A proportionate approach to risk, ensuring those formal systems are in place at the higher levels, but that the behaviours and the competence of industry is reflected across the whole piece. I hope by this stage in my presentation you're already convinced of this, but let's be absolutely clear. This change is coming. And it won't be the end of the story. There will be more to follow because there are more elements that we have to look at and address, but we have to build the foundations on this regime, get it working and learn as we go. There will be new regulation, I am sure, on products because we now have the Morel Day report, which tells us some of the shortcomings in our product testing and assurance regime, and some of those will be addressed by the new construction products regulator. So we all have to continue to work together to ensure that this new regime and this new system beds in. And I suspect we all know already that there are other challenges that we have to address. Things like the recent concerns about aerated concrete and the emerging concerns about electric vehicles in underground car parks are obvious examples of where there is more thinking we still have to do about how this regime might apply. But what's for sure is that record keeping and proof and information, sharing that information, exchanging that information, have to be at the heart of the system that we take forward. So in closing, let's all recognise that this is not just about new regulation, but about a change of mindset from everyone. I want to ask you all not just to focus on what you need to do to be in compliance, but to commit to being part of making this new system work. Work collaboratively. Show leadership. When you see others exhibiting old behaviours of the past, stop them, remind them the regime's changed. We need to operate and behave differently. And above all, never ever forget why we are doing this. None of us want to experience that horrible feeling that we all felt in June 2017 ever again. My view is that we focus on collaborating, on working together, and we seize this opportunity to deliver new and better outcomes for everyone, we will have achieved a lot. Thank you.